Hello, welcome to Art Mirrors Futures. Time for another story. If my previous story about Arnolfini portrait and its non-mirror was complex, the story will be 10 times more complex. This time I don't even know where to start the story, so let me just start from the postcard. What you see here, also just behind me, a typical postcard. In this case it's Antwerp. It's a market square of this Flemish city. You see here the very famous sculpture of the soldier called Brabo. It is after him the whole province is called Brabant. But we also see on the left side, you see the city hall of the city, and decorated by the flags. And apparently there's also a mirror in this picture. It's not that easy to spot it if you don't know where to look, but I can help you. This is another picture of the same building. You could see here one of the sculptures decorating the facade of this building. Here is a close-up of the sculpture. You could see here a woman holding a mirror, but also a snake. A fairly bizarre combination. And interestingly enough, I didn't notice this sculpture for years. And when I did notice it, I didn't know how to interpret it. Basically, I thought it may be, Venus, or perhaps, Athens, because of the snake. There's nothing specifically unique about Antwerp. I can show you the other building. Oh, basically, it's another postcard of another building. This time, or today, it's a royal palace in Amsterdam. But originally, actually, it was also City Hall of Amsterdam. In many, many ways was copied by or made after the City Hall in Antwerp. So not surprisingly, it also has the sculpture of women with a mirror. It's even less noticeable. The building is much taller than in Antwerp, and the sculpture is just on the roof, so not very easy to spot. It's not impossible, but in principle it's not very noticeable. And then it is exactly the same sort of composition. There's a lady there holding a mirror, quite impressive, quite a bulky mirror, in fact, and also a snake weaving around her arm. Both these sculptures are representing the same figure, known as Prudence. It is actually, if you don't know, you could read it underneath the sculpture in Antwerp. There's a writing called Prudence, or Prudence if it's originally Latin. But interestingly, and this is one of those cases when even if I tell you what this is Prudence or Prudence, it doesn't mean much. Very few people today would understand what it means. Prudence is a very old word. It's rarely used in the language today, in English and in other languages, and its meaning somehow evades from people. If you drive through France, sometimes you could meet this kind of sign, Prudence, with the children crossing the road, which is apparently may be interpreted as be careful. Otherwise, like there's a children ahead, pay more attention. In Dutch, it's called Voorzichtigheid or Voorzichtig. So kind of, again, be careful, handle with care. It could be on a packaging side, or something dangerous ahead. Prudence is known in financial circles. For example, we can see that the banks are behaving not prudently if they make too risky investment and bankrupt. A pretty good starting point for this story could be Nantes. It's a French city in the northwest of France. Right now is, of course, integral part of France. But in the past, it used to be a capital city of the very independent kingdom called Brittany, or Bretagne. In this cathedral, we can find the tomb of Francis II. He was the last king of independent Brittany. It was his daughter, in fact, Anna of Brittany, became the queen of France. Anna of Brittany is a pretty unique figure. She's perhaps the only woman who was king. She was a queen 3 times. First, she married sort of on distance remotely to the emperor of Holy Roman Empire, Maximilian I. But this marriage was sort of annulled, and she then married Charles VIII, exactly the person who took Brittany. And then after his death, she became the wife of his ancestor, not direct ancestor, but somebody who took the throne, Louis XII. What we see here is a tomb, and then it was Anna who commissioned this cathedral, and then eventually also the tomb of Francis II. It was him and his wife And then a few years ago, in 2008, the cathedral celebrated its 500th anniversary. And then I think because of that, they surrounded this tomb with a bit of a fence. So it's not that easy now to take pictures. But you see now the look and feel of this monumental tomb. It's beautifully made. The marble was brought from Carrara. Um, the sculptor or the author or the artist who created this, Michel Colomb, was one of the most famous artists of this time. So he worked for a few years on this monument. It's beautifully carved. It's a fantastically intricate marble, almost lacing on the sculptures. This picture, on this picture, you could see three figures surrounding the tomb of the king. But actually, I'm most interested in the fourth one, which is you don't see it from here, and that's the sculpture, and this is Prudence. Of course, she holds a mirror, and that's exactly because I'm interested in. But in addition to mirror, she doesn't hold a snake. She actually holds a compass in her right hand. The snake is underneath. She's stomping on this. Well, sometimes people say snake or maybe even small dragon or lizard, some kind of creature, and she's stomping on that. But in the next picture, you could see the mirror itself. It's a very interesting model. She holds it in her hand, but in reality, it's in this particular case, she holds it in her hand, but in fact, it is a table mirror. It was placed on the table, and its upper part could be rotating. Before we go to the next picture, perhaps there's a point to show you the sign of Prudence, or at least kind of with a drumming sound, warn you that there will be something not so good, or maybe even dangerous ahead. The issue is here that despite the sculpture of the lady itself is beautiful, it also has very strange and sort of slightly disturbing element. It has two heads. On the back of the head of the young lady, we see the face of old man, not necessarily very peaceful. At least in a twilight of this cathedral, it may be quite shocking. Here you could see the full size. Actually, the sculpture is pretty big. They're almost like human size. So when it was without the fence, you could also almost confront and face to face with this unpleasant figure. Who is she then? These four figures can help us to understand it better. What we see actually, it's the very famous four cardinal virtues of Christianity. These four figures represent fortitude, justice, temperance, and finally prudence. Each of them is depicted or portrayed with their specific attributes. For example, justice with her famous scales and sometimes sword, fortitude with a tower, and so on, and prudence with a mirror. What's so interesting about these figures? They were very, very central to sort of moral conduct of every Christian. That's why they were absolutely famous. Everybody knew about them. Europe for centuries, or population of Europe for centuries was very well aware of this thing. That's why for them it will be no problem and no question at all to interpret those sculptures and of course all the monuments in Antwerp and Amsterdam. And yet it's completely evaporated today. Partly we can say because Christianity disappeared, but then the question is why should we be bothered? Why should we remain this? Why should we retain this knowledge about these figures? And also, looking backwards, interestingly, these figures are not present, for example, in the Bible, neither in Old Testaments or New Testaments, and the question is how they came to Christianity is also very interesting. In fact, this is one of the very rare cases when we can spot this sort of appearance of this figures in Christianity pretty accurately, almost precisely. The person who almost single-handedly introduced these four figures into Christianity is Thomas Aquinas, or Aquinas in some traditions. The city he's from was called Aquine. The city he's coming from called Aquinas in Italian. He is a fresco. He would depict in Thomas. I think it's in Florence. And what is so interesting about him that he not only introduced this particular figures, but actually he reintroduced, is perhaps more correctly to say, he legitimized or re-legitimized, complex word, such figures as Aristotle or Plato. They're actually depicted here on his left and right side. Then to explain the context and why it's so interesting, you need to maybe remember the peculiar trajectory of European history. At some point, Plato and Aristotle were very much respected thinkers, for example, back in Greece and of course later in Rome. And then their importance was lost because of the collapse of Roman Empire. Their works were known in Byzantium, that eventually became Christian Byzantium, and then in principle they were known in Europe in early centuries of the first millennium. But because of sort of peculiar relationship of Christianity to the pre-Christian history, both Plato, Aristotle, and of course many other Roman authors were sort of no-go in many ways. They were pagans, and any Roman author would be like enemy of Christianity. So although their works were not so much known, and if known, sort of not very welcomed in a discourse of early Christian thinkers. And Thomas managed somehow to reintroduce them back to the circulation, also kind of approving their presence. In his book, known as Summa Theologica, or sometimes just simply Summa, he somehow argued that Christianity would be like, it would be okay to reuse them, and they're not that necessarily that bad. They're still not good, they're still pagans, they're still not Christian, but we can use their works, we can use their ideas, and a good Christian can benefit from that. This explanation, of course, is very, very sort of brutally simplified version of the events, but I cannot do much more within the framework of these discussions. What is interesting for my story about mirrors is also, and specifically about Prudence, that Thomas also introduced all these four concepts of all the four virtues of Christianity are directly borrowed from the work of Aristotle. In fact, Thomas almost directly put or placed the concept of Aristotle in ethics to his treatise, to his own Summa. The book of Aristotle, known as Nicomachean Ethics, is one of his last books. Basically, it's dedicated to his son, kind of a guidance how to behave well for any Greek. So in Greece, in ancient Greece, this was a kind of compendium of moral behavior. According to Aristotle, every Greek has to have to aim to have this a set of virtues. The virtues, what I mentioned before, fortitude, temperance, are of course not the ones that are described by Aristotle, because obviously Aristotle described them in Greek. The whole concept of virtue, what we now know as virtue, and it was also Latin word, in Greek was called areta, and this four main aretes, or in Latin, virtues of Greek were Andrea, which is courage or fortitude, Sophrosune, and Dikasune. Dikasune is for justice. And then, of course, prudence was known as phronensis. To explain the meaning of prudence, I can maybe refer to the example sometimes provided by Aristotle himself, sometimes through his commentary. You could imagine that he would give advice to Alexander the Great, his famous pupil, when entering the battle. In this case, you see the fresco of the battle between Alexander and his arch-enemy Darius from Persia. And then, as every Greek, Alexander must go and confront the enemy bravely and without any hesitation. That's, of course, the work of fortitude, or Andrea, in practice. However, Aristotle, of course, commends that it's not always that easy. What if, for example, the battle... what, for example, if the army of the enemy is much bigger than yours and much larger, and then when entering the battle, very likely you will be defeated and die yourself, and maybe your enemy and your army will also die. Would it be wise to go to the battle in these conditions? And of course, the answer is no. Maybe it's better to retreat, to find new partners, to realign your forces, and then attack your enemy when you have more chances to win. This calculation of the possible outcome may define whether you need to enter the battle or not. However, and again, Aristotle comments that it's not that simple either. In some cases, even if you know very well that you very likely will be defeated and you may even die, there's still point to go to the battles and enter. And perhaps your death or your sacrifice will be remembered, whether by your contemporary or maybe even your ancestors. It is because of your death, actually, eventually, your enemy will be defeated. So there's kind of a apparently very simple decision whether to enter or not and what you have to consider. That's exactly the work of prudence. It's a prudence defines all these decisions. And then, and after that, after the decision is made, then other virtues would be mobilized. So it is in this context we can understand the famous metaphor of chariot used by Aristotle to explain the sort of relationship between the prudence, who is a rider of this chariot, and other virtues that could be horses, governed or supervised or commanded by prudence. This diagram represents sort of my best understanding of the concept of phronesis, how it was explained by Aristotle. So the work of prudence starts from the stage when you need to make a decision. When you don't when you don't have this need to make a decision, you don't need anything. You just keep doing what you're doing. It is a moment when you have uncertainty, when you don't know what's next. In principle, this sort of need could be very big when a decision is complex. You really don't know what to do next, or even maybe slightly hesitating, and you have to kind of reconsider your previous way of working. When you get this need and when you realize the things, you enter a very, very special space. The first space of prudence is reflective. So I think it's very, very typical to hear this advices from Aristotle and his contemporary: don't make haste, don't hurry up. When you have a difficult decision, you have to take a pause. You have to kind of, stop yourself. And the stopness of the sort of the pause is not because of indecisiveness or idleness. It's a very important stage for you to kind of reflect. Why here? What do you need to do? And it starts this. Before you decide what to do next, you have to understand yourself. Who are you? That's a very, very famous Greek mantra. Know yourself first. Know, or in English, know thyself. And a very, very important part of this understanding yourself, it's actually the work of memory. So it's a second space, it's a memory space. You have to remember and maybe recall not only your personal life, in a way, biography, your own personal trajectory and your own personal goals, but also understand yourself within the context of collective. Who are you as a unity, as a society, as a culture? For Aristotle, of course, it was equal to be Greeks. Who are we? Who are Greeks? What we want to achieve as a whole community, as a whole culture. And only after that, you kind of engage in what we call with a foreseeing space or foresighting space. You try to envisage possible futures, possible outcome of your actions, and like multiple futures. The more accurate, the more sort of diverse you are in this sort of imagining the future, the better. And then the work of prudence, in a way, kind of stops when you make a choice, right choice for yourself, and depending on your previous history, and right choice depending on a collective history of all the, in this case, Greeks. Then, after the decision is made, the action space, the sort of your future is executed. So basically, you then start to implement it. For example, in case of the battle, whether you engage in a battle or retreat or do any other appropriate things. And then one of those possible futures is becoming now. Then, of course, it's not a stop, it's only becoming the next step. You always, again, in a situation of the making next decision, and then you have to repeat all the process once again. So it's a very typical iterative scheme. The concept as such was pretty well understood by Greeks, and then eventually, and with time, it migrated to Romans, right? So Romans, as I said, they knew the work of Aristotle, they sort of admired them, appreciated. So in many, many ways, sort of the ethical code of conduct of Greeks was accepted by Romans with a number of, appropriate modification, of course, but the concept of virtues were incorporated. That's how they got their names. There's fortitude, prudence, and so on. The case of prudence is really interesting. And I think also because of peculiarity of the concept and its centrality. We know that the pantheons of gods of Greeks and Romans are very much compatible. The Greeks have Zeus, Greeks had Zeus and Romans have Jupiter. Greek had Aphrodite and then Roman had Venus, and so on and so on. Many of their gods are very, very much compatible. However, Romans also had a number of unique gods. One of them is Janus. Janus is a very peculiar god. It doesn't exist in Greek mythology. Janus is a very interesting deity. He was in charge of transits, of any transitions, both physical transitions. For example, Janus was a known god of doors and gates. So when you enter, or when you cross a gate, so when you go through the door, interestingly, you kind of leave one space and then enter another space. You could also interpret it pretty symbolically, sort of this moment of transit. So Janus was in charge of that. But it's also time, right? When you finish one business and start another business, when you finish one cycle, one period, and go to another one. Janus was in charge of that. We may think that we forgot about this god, but in reality, every time we start our January, we kind of make a bow to Janus. January is exactly his month. The depiction of Janus was diverse, but very often included this sort of two-head figures, like this one. And not always, it was sometimes young men and old men, often not only, it was in different sculptures, in monuments, also sort of on coins. This particular sculpture is still could be found on a very old bridge. I think it's the oldest bridge in Rome. And of course, Janus was also in charge of bridges. So when Prudence arrived to Rome, then it was very much, very quickly associated with the activities of the god Janus. The second important thing is, of course, even the name of Prudence came from its closeness and its affinity to sort of foreseeing and forecasting. In fact, the first name that Romans gave to Phronesis was Providence. Not Prudence, but Prudence is a kind of truncated name of Providence. And Providence is kind of the allegory or the sort of the figure in charge of thinking about the future, or predicting the future. The concept of future and dealing with it was understood by Greeks and Romans in an interesting way. They obviously understood the future is not predictable, even for gods, because the parkas who weave the fate of the people, also gods as well, although even gods are immortal, their future is not very predictable, paradoxically. However, you better listen what the gods have to say about your future. So this whole idea of predicting and sort of foreseeing was more or less reading the signals, reading the possible voices and interpreting them properly. The business was really, really active in Rome, in Greece too, but in Rome it was really one of the most flourishing businesses. We see here the fresco from Pompeii, showing the earliest future teller of your forecaster. Eventually, Providence was elevated to the status of the goddess. For example, I can show you a few coins of Providence depicting this newly minted goddess, literally, with her sort of toolkits. I'd love to see this her holding a mirror. Very likely it's not a mirror. It's something like a orb or maybe even patera. It's a sort of special bowl that you use for sacrifices. I once found a very interesting coin, which I still don't know how to interpret properly. I'd like to learn more about these things. And it's apparently Providence with a very sophisticated toolkits for predicting the future, apparently, sort of the whole installation. So at this moment, and when and after we sort of figure out a little bit about the skeleton of the concept of prudence in Aristotle and later in Rome, and skipping its possible developments in Byzantium, we can go back to the times of Thomas, when he introduced his or reintroduced these virtues into the Christian theology and sort of intellectual landscape, intellectual narrative of Europeans in the 12th century. Thomas introduced these four, or rather reintroduced those four virtues of Aristotle, but also he added three more. They're known as Christian values, or maybe theological virtues, known as hope and faith, and then the last one is either love or charity. There's these three, and together with other four, they created this very famous seven. This is a full set of Christian values, or Christian virtues, I should say. And this is the very, very typical depiction of that. Here in this set, we see already Prudence in the form which is by now familiar to you. That's the lady holding a mirror and holding a snake. The earliest version of Prudence, the earliest depiction of Prudence I found so far, can be found in Padua. It's in a famous Scraveni chapel, or church of Scraveni. The interior of the church inside is beautiful. It's one of the points of, or one of the sites of pilgrimage for artists for centuries. In addition to the sort of the typical iconography of Christianity, this particular church has like one of the earliest depiction of those new concept of the virtues. They are situated in the flanks of the church and the sides, like one on the left side. On one side you see only the virtues, and on the other side the vices. Among those virtues, we can see the figure of Prudence. I think she's the only one that is not depicted as a fool. She's kind of standing behind or sitting behind the desk of some sort. But we also can spot she's holding the mirror. My guess it's already a glass mirror. There's no snake, but she holds a kind of pen or something in her right hand, and there's a book in front of her. What is remarkable is also this sort of the second face, or the second head on the back of her own head. It's a kind of old man, which is barely visible. It's interesting that this figure, or this depiction, appeared like 30 years after the first publication of Thomas. So it's pretty earlier. Already painters learn how to do or figure out how to depict this very complex concept of prudence. I found another work frequently attributed to Giotto. It's a church in Italian city Assi. Basically, it's a ceiling of the church is covered by a colossal fresco, sort of indicated by the white rectangle, the group of virtues. And we see here Prudence again, among other virtues. And we see here her holding mirror. Although there's this very strange device, kind of something in front of her. I don't know exactly what it is. It looks like a gong or a dial or something, maybe watches, but maybe also just a place to hold it, to put a mirror later on. And she has the second head. In this case, it's a head of the old woman. And then both heads are surrounded by the halo of some sort, like indicating the status of the sanity. Interesting, she's referred as Saint Prudence in this particular fresco. So apparently it was very confusing for these people to kind of attribute what's allegorical. So, for example, we can find later on this relief. I think it's one of the churches of Florence has it. That's a very bizarre combination. We see already familiar attributes, like, for example, the mirror. Interesting that we see here the snakes. I shouldn't say the earliest snake, but pretty early. The work itself, it's from the middle of 14th century. What is unusual here, of course, we see the wings, like as if she's an angel, and also with the halo behind her head. Interestingly, there's a second head somehow underneath, kind of from under her skirt, or that's pretty bizarre. And I don't know how people were confused with this sort of depictions, what exactly it means, what's the meaning of that. Another example of the early depiction of Prudence can be found in the large cycle of works by Ambrogio Lorenzetti. He was Italian master from Siena, and this is his famous work of I think it's called Allegory of Bad and Good Rulers. This is frescoes from the city hall of Siena. And then in this particular case, you could see the elements of fragments representing the good ruler, like a good king, surrounded by these virtues. And Prudence sitting right next to him on the right side, indicating her importance for the good ruler. So the good ruler should be prudent. Interestingly enough, I've been there, I've seen this work, and I didn't notice the mirror. I, of course, knew that the Prudence figure here, but because of the quality, the frescoes are not in a good conditions and somehow partly fading by now. But I lately wrote about this work and I said, what if she would hold a mirror? Only later I realized she actually does hold a mirror. It's very strange, sort of big and almost like, bowl. perhaps very early convex mirrors of large size, and she's holding them she's holding this mirror in a very strange posture. She's not looking at this mirror. So in addition to that, for quite a while I was not able to depict or to decipher what exactly written, what sort of the wordings, the messages. Much later, and with some help, I depicted it. I just decoded the things. Actually, it says praeteritum praesenti futurare. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it very accurately, but the meaning of this word is exactly that: the past, present, and the future. That's a work of Prudence, which is, just in case, I just one more time confirmed the complex diagram I was showing it to you. Eventually, iconography of Prudence became colossal. I in my collection have a few hundreds of her depictions of all sorts, as I mentioned. So for today, I will limit perhaps myself with a few more examples, just Italian, and then I have to tell another story about how Prudence was presented later in northern schools in Germany, for example, in the Netherlands. Here, just a few examples to show the diversity of the thing. So one of them on the left side, you see the Prudence from Cassoni. Cassoni were sort of chests when ladies kept their, I think it's dowry, before the marriage. We see a young lady, again with a mirror. What she's holding may look like a snake, but in principle could be also seen as a cornucopia. It's a sort of the symbol of abundance. And actually only confirmed. On the right side you see the drawing. It's much later, it's 16th century, but we see exactly the same things, like the lady is holding the mirror and cornucopia. So this is for me very, very typical, that Prudence is one non-stop history of kind of assemblage, of assembling these symbols and misinterpreting, you putting another one. So for me that's a fantastic history of reinterpretation, misinterpretation, reinterpretation again, and correcting, and so on and so on. So this is example another Cassoni. I found it in the Courtauld Museum in London. That's how Cassoni looked like in reality. That is very, very elaborate example. And on a side walls of this, there are two Cassonis, and there are four virtues presented on each of those sides. One of them is Prudence. We see again the young lady holding a mirror. In fact, in this mirror you could always see the reflection if you look carefully. But there's no double head, there's only one. And at the same time there are two snakes. So that's, again, strange twist in the story. And the last one I can show you a couple of more examples. It's Tondo, it's Maiolica, pretty big. It's about 60 centimeters in diameter. And then very likely it was placed outside in the facade of the home. Very likely it was four of them or a number of them depicting different virtues. Here we see another set, for example, the lady, but this time with a double head. We see the sort of the face of the old man. She's holding snake, and then also mirror. And then snakes can become the dragon in this case, or even lion. So kind of leaning toward the interpretation of the Prudence as commanding the evil forces, or maybe the animal forces. So I'd like to finish the story for today. Otherwise it would be very, very long. I'll come back, and I think maybe just as a way of entering conclusions, this was one of the first stories when I really understood, or sort of felt that how this exploration would be very important and very valuable for my professional futuristic activities. This particular story literally tells that it's not only nice to have, nice to sort of once in a while read about history, but you must read about history. You must go and reinterpret it all the time. It's literally what the Prudence is about. And then, so without this activity, you really cannot do the future thing properly. So I plan to come back to the story again, just maybe to inevitably reinterpreting the what I said. And there's some big untold elements, hundreds of work of Prudence. I'd like to, if not not all, but at least some of them, I'd like to show late work in Dutch, German, English, examples French, but also even earlier. As I mentioned, for example, the Byzantium work still for me big unknown. And I hope to find some other example in other cultures and other sort of art schools. So then, till the next stories. See you, bye.